Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. Thank you for joining us. Well, I want to formally welcome everybody to our webinar today, Advantages and Strategic Considerations for GovCons with Commercial Clients. So I'm Yevgeny Sahenko. I'm a partner in our Outsourced Accounting and Advisory Services Department here at GRF. Today, I'm joined by my wonderful colleagues, John Pace and Paul Calabrese. John is a partner and director of our Outsourced Accounting and Advisory Services Department, and Paul is a principal in that same department. So the three of us have a wealth of knowledge and experience working in the government contracting space. And so hopefully we have a lot of what you'll find great information to share with you today. So just some quick housekeeping items before we dive into the content. Anybody seeking CPE credit today must complete and submit a short survey that will appear automatically following the webinar. To obtain the CPE, you will just need to participate in our polling questions, which hopefully you won't find too burdensome or difficult to answer. Those polling questions will be how we're going to gauge your active participation, so please do participate when they do pop up on the screen. One actual very important note: this webinar is not intended as financial or legal advice. This is simply for educational purposes. So with that, once again, we're GRF CPAs and advisors. We're based out of Bethesda, Maryland. We serve clients in the DMV area, as well as nationally and internationally. We serve a wide range of clients covering not-for-profit, schools, for-profit, government contractors, and many, many others. We've been in operation for several decades now, and in 2021, we celebrated our 40-year anniversary. So we have a lot to cover today, hopefully exciting content for you all. So without further ado, let's jump into it. And I think I will hand it over to John.
Awesome. Oops. Thank you, Yevgeny, and good morning, everyone. And thanks again for joining us today. I see people are joining the webinar as we speak, so that's good. Welcome to everyone. Happy Wednesday. A little gray and cloudy here in the DC area, so thanks again for joining us. So I'm going to start off this morning talking about some of the advantages of bringing in commercial contracts to your company. And we're going to start with a few high-level advantages. And as you can see on the screen here, diversified revenue streams is one. The ability to have innovation and cross-pollination is another. Competitiveness, enhancing your competitiveness in the market. And again, finally, improved resilience and flexibility is another key component here. And so we're going to touch on these. We're going to interweave these throughout my portion of the presentation this morning. But before we get into that level of detail, since this does qualify for CPE, and as Evgeny mentioned, we're going to start with our first polling question. So if Nathan, you can bring up that polling question, that would be great. So do you have concerns about adding commercial contracts to your business? So let's get some feedback there, and then we'll move on. So we'll give everyone just a few seconds to answer the polling questions. Okay, great. So it looks like, okay, so all right. So hopefully then it looks like 42% of you all do have some concerns. So we can talk about some of those concerns. And one of the things that I'm going to do right now is dive into some of the detail on the advantages. And oops, moved the slides a little too quickly. Let me back up here. Okay, 1 second. Okay, so let's first start off with talking about advantages of diversifying your revenue stream. And one of the first concepts I want to talk about, and I'm sure weighs heavy on your minds, is reducing that dependency on a single sector. And we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to start off each slide with some advantages of working on government contractors before we get into some of the advantages of working with commercial. But as you can see, and as I'm sure most of you have experienced, the government does provide a high level of stability, whether it's a down economic time or in general. It generally provides a really good, stable contract base. Not always, but in generally speaking, you have that advantage in working with the government. One of the other big advantages that we see, and we'll touch on more in subsequent slides, is that payment cycle for government contractors. Many of our clients are paid just a few days after invoicing, and that's just great for cash flow management. And in the commercial markets, you don't necessarily see that as quickly. Typically, commercial organizations try to age their payables a little bit, or just pay within the payment terms. So with that being said, let's talk about some of the advantages of commercial contracts or commercial endeavors. One of the big things here, especially if you're working on cost reimbursable contracts or cost type contracts, is this concept of profitability. Commercial contracts are often more profitable, and pulling that back to the cost type contracts, those type of contracts are basically your cost plus a reasonable profit or fee. And in, your experience in your industry matters. The agency that you work with matters, but typically, we've seen profit margins or fees as low as 1 or 2%. So they can certainly be higher than that, and your mileage may vary, as they say. But those constraints are not typically there with commercial contracts. So that can be a nice way to kind of diversify that bottom line for you and get more net income to your business. Um, Compliance requirements and little to no compliance requirements for commercial contracts. I think that's one of the reasons we're all here. Government contracting is complex. There are regulations, there are government audits, there are incurred cost submissions, calculations of indirect rates, all those things that make this industry a bit challenging and create a bit of a learning curve or a barrier to entry for government contracting. So you just don't have that with commercial contracts. So that's a nice thing. And so directly leading into that is a reduction in administrative burdens. To the extent that you can add those commercial contracts, I feel like it helps alleviate a little bit on your operations team. Maybe your operations team is you, in terms of just that day-to-day administration. So that's a good thing. Proprietary disclosures or lack thereof. In our discussions with our clients, this is definitely an area that gives many of you anxiety. Whether you are providing, confidential information on your cost and pricing to government agencies, or many of you work with prime government contractors, we know that that's a source of anxiety for you. And, we have many conversations with our clients. Do you really want to do this and things like that? So that's something that you just don't typically have to do with commercial contracts. So that again goes back to easing administrative burdens, and because that full cost data is typically available to the government. So that's a nice thing not to have to do for commercial contracts. One of the things we don't talk about as often, though, is what we call ramp up time. From the time that you sign that contract or awarded a contract, there can be a ramp up period, and what we mean by that is the time between when you sign the contract and when you're able to actually start performing on the contract, start invoicing, start generating cash flow. So there can be a ramp up period there, and often with commercial contracts, we just see less of a ramp up period. So speeding that contract into operations for you, increasing your revenue, increasing your cash flow. So it's part of an overall theme of agility and reduced bureaucracy. So you're going to hear us talk about that on many occasions this morning. So just that overall bureaucracy that we all know comes with dealing with the government. You don't have that on commercial contractors nearly as much. We do know that you might be working with some very large companies if you're doing commercial contracts, and they're not all going to be smooth sailing. But at the end of the day, on the whole, it's going to be an overall reduced bureaucracy. So I'm going to move to the next slide here.
And John, while you're doing that, one thing too that I think is very real is in a bit of like almost like a side benefit of what you spoke to with the smaller ramp up time. I think the side benefit of that is also maybe more predictability in terms of your cash flow planning. Because what I found too with some clients is the ones that have more of their composition of their revenue on the GovCon side, because of that slight instability, if you want to call it that, or uncertainty surrounding when exactly will the contract ramp up, it's kind of hard to project out when exactly you're going to start collecting, the payments and things like that. And collecting in the sense that not collectability concerns, but more so when is it going to ramp up when I'm actually going to be able to see the revenue in my financial statement. So I find that that's helpful as well.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And there's a funny story. It's I think it's semi-related, at least, that Jerry Rosenberg, one of the founders of this firm, used to say, he had and this was a long time ago, but he had a client that won a large IDIQ contract. And so it was, they threw a huge party and they were like, they thought, everything was going to be great. But they didn't get a task order under that contract. They never got a single task order under that contract. So it's kind of related to the ramp up issue. But, just kind of, highlights some of the challenges of working with the government there. So that's why we're having this discussion this morning. And, we can talk about the benefits of innovation and cross-pollination there. I think they're pretty closely related. We're going to weave these two topics together. You're going to see how we're going to hit on some of the topics as advantages on both. So that kind of leads to that cross-pollination aspect of what we're talking about. But many of our clients we work with clients of all sizes. Many are smaller, many are just getting started, to medium-sized businesses to large. So here's some benefits that you may be already aware of, or things that may be opportunities for you in the future. So let's start off with some of those. R&D funding, so research and development funding. So there are lots of government contracts out there that will allocate significant funding towards that R&D. And so basically what that allows you to do is you can pursue projects that you might not otherwise be able to afford. Effectively, they are paying you for research and development. And in some cases, you are still the owner of that intellectual property. Some cases transfers to the government, so it just kind of depends. So that can provide a pretty big benefit. Just the overall diversity of the project opportunities with working with the government. The government often has complex, large-scale challenges that really require novel solutions, a lot of innovation. So that helps drive that innovation and creativity. So that's a benefit. And one of the things we see quite a lot too is this access to advanced technology that you might not otherwise have. Government contracts can offer access to cutting edge technologies. And I like this comment about the facilities too. Just the facilities themselves could be very cutting edge. Just depends on your industry and where you are and what you're doing. So that enables your company to work with state-of-the-art innovations. So a lot of these things already, but how do we weave that into commercial contract success and cross-pollination? And so let's start off with the concept of innovation and speed of innovation. I don't think there's really any organization on earth that can match the buying power of the United States government, at least right now. And so we know that's going to be a big source of funding for government contractors. And, so that's a great thing. But often that comes at the cost of bureaucracy, like we said, complex requirements, things of that nature. So what we often see is that the commercial industry is driving innovation and technology at a quicker pace. They may not have the size and scale of the United States government, but at the end of the day, I think it's a nice kind of mix where the US government has this sheer size, but the commercial industries can move things at a faster pace. I just lost the slides, but I can go 1 second here. Okay, so just continuing on that thread, of driving that technology at a faster pace. One of the benefits to being of cross-pollination, I talked a little bit about exposure to technology, right? As part of being a government contractor. The same thing is true on the commercial side. So you can take advantage of the experience that you got being a government contractor and having the access to that technology. And at the same time, the technology that you get access to as a commercial contractor, you can bring those things both together. I think it helps demonstrate performance. It'll help you basically apply what you've learned, building your professional company resume, if you will. And what I think that does, in addition, basically has the effect of enhancing your overall reputation. So you're working on both. I think it just makes you more competitive. So as we move to the next slide, and there's a slight lag there on the slide. There we go. Talking about competitiveness, let's talk about enhanced market competitiveness by bringing in those commercial contracts. So basically what it means is you have a dual client base. It helps broaden your company's expertise, makes you more competitive. Yeah, again, touching back to what we started with, diversifies your company's revenue, gives you some strength there. And I think this diverse experience helps you meet varied client requirements. So it just speaks to experience, I think. And, of course, if you're doing well and you're delivering high quality outcomes in different environments, it enhances your marketability, your agility, your reputation. All of those things, I think, lead to increased sustainability for your company and, hopefully success going down the road. So those are great things, I think, and good advantages to bringing in commercial contracts and combining them with your government contracts. So the last thing that I think that I would touch on before we turn it over to Paul is this is sort of concept of improved resilience and flexibility. And so this is building on the things that we've talked about so far. And, when we're speaking in generalities here, your situation may vary a little bit differently from others depending on your industry, but quite often government projects have longer life cycles, and more strict regulations. And you can create a mix. I've seen our clients create kind of a portfolio, if you will, of contracts that have shorter, medium, and longer term. And that's a kind of a nice thing if you do have the luxury of being able to do that over time and add those type of contracts into your mix. I think it helps. Maybe you aren't trapped into a contract with a super long life cycle. You can balance that out with some diversity. Um, Again, going back to the kind of the agility concept, commercial projects typically have quicker turnarounds and just a little bit overall more agility. And I think, and we've seen that lead to kind of the ability to adapt to changing project demands and timelines. I think many of us have probably been in situations where what you thought the project scope was going to be gets changed. Maybe what you started working on is just really no longer technologically feasible, or it's just simply not going to work. So I think the process in tweaking those contracts, adjusting those to the realities of the environment that you're in, is just a little bit easier on the commercial side. Um, so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Paul, and Paul's going to take the presentation a little bit further, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper into some of these issues. So Paul, over to you.
All
And
right.
Paul, maybe just if you don't mind, before you just jump in, what one quick point that I think you had in an earlier slide, John, that I thought when I saw it again, I wanted to highlight it because I think it's something we don't often think about. The point made about getting basically through the GovCon side of your house, getting the path to R&D projects and getting those funded. I think that's pretty critical because I think what I've typically observed in the commercial side is those R&D costs are usually, I mean, they're in most cases going to be hitting your P&L. They're an expense, and the return on the investment of those costs, you may not see it one ever, but likely if you do see it, it will take some time. Whereas through the government contracting vehicle, I mean, your return on investment, if you want to call it that, it could really be on a cost reimbursable contract the next month, right? So I mean, your conversion of your return on investment of those costs is much quicker on the GovCon side as well. So anyway, sorry about that, Paul. Please, all you.
Okay. All right. So let's go on and talk about DCA's perspective in all of this. And I think most of us, that's the elephant in the room. So from part of this is we need to consider the fact that what is the driver? What is the main thing that drives this unique situation with commercial contracting? And there are two scenarios overall. You may, as a government contractor, have fixed price, time and material contracts, and looking at commercial world, or you may have a mix of contracts and have cost reimbursable contracts. And those cost reimbursable contracts do a different thing. And so we all know Defense Contract Audit Agency, DCAA, is the oversight function. There are other agencies that have cognizant auditors or use independent public accounting firms to do the reviews. But basically, someone is going to take, especially if you have cost reimbursable contracts, they're going to be looking at that. And so as DCA is that cognizant auditor and they're looking at oversight, we also got an administrative contracting officer that can initiate specialized audits or reviews or finally make the determination on an audit that DCA did that's advisory. So we got the regulation, we got the oversight, and finally we have enforcement. And so there's a lot of things going on here that they must adhere to and a lot of different roles. And those roles are going to impact how you deal with your commercial side. So the commercial side, pretty much very quiet. We all know that as far as compliance go. And so what I wanted to talk today about what drives the administration, what drives the bureaucracy as you begin to consider the fact of balancing with commercial firms. And what does mostly is cost reimbursable contracts. If you have cost reimbursable contracts, they are actually driving the involvement of the audit firms. There's also something called fixed price based on truth and negotiation certified cost of pricing data, which I won't go in, and that too can start a post-award or defective pricing review. But most of it, when you look down, we'll look at it in a minute, and you go down the line, it's cost reimbursable contracts. I know firms within our client base that will totally avoid cost reimbursable contracts at all costs. And you can see why, because basically the regulations 31.2 cost principles, but also FAR 15.4 negotiation on pricing. So those are the two things that really influence the commercial world. So let's get in a little bit into that detail. And we can see just a long list here. And so the first thing I would tell you is, before I even start with this list, which many of you are quite aware of, is the fact that if you've got fixed price, time and material contracts, that's going to be a lot more competitive. That whole world is going to be a lot more competitive with commercial contracts than if you have cost reimbursable. You got fixed price contracts, time and material. You probably don't see the government auditors interfering much with you or asking you much. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So it is definitely the CPFF, the cost reimbursable contracts, that's the driver. You can see the list there. Timekeeping is critical. There's no doubt about it. It is one of the most important things, especially since most of the entities probably listening are service firms, and timekeeping, and the government can do floor checks, estimating with projections or proposals. And you go down the line, and these are all the things that cost reimbursable contracting bring in and highlight. If you do deal with indirect rates and you're projecting indirect rates, you got to have an annual budget. How can you project an indirect rate if you don't have an annual budget? So you need the annual budget to be developed, and then you can project the rates, and they will come out as you would expect them to come out. So you can see CPFF invoicing is a world unto itself. And if you have a small entity, as we have some small and some large ones, and they don't have the sophisticated, software like a UNet or a Deltek or a JAMIS, they've got to do this process manually, put it on a public voucher, the 1034, the 1035 detail, and I help them do it. And doing it manually is a very time-consuming process. So these are some of the things, the higher bureaucracy, the higher administrative costs that's involved in doing it, as well as things like travel and following the JTRs. So,
and Paul, real quick, just like one thing that I think helped me tremendously, if on your previous slide, like why there's so much scrutiny placed on the CPFF side, the cost reimbursable side, is because it's effectively the government has a duty back to the taxpayers to ensure that its funds are being used as appropriately as possible, right? And on the cost reimbursable side, you're often getting payment, let's say within 30 to 60 days of invoice submission. So you have to have the sound justification for those costs.
absolutely. So it is a process that you deal with. Some people avoid the cost reimbursable. But what is DCA's big deal? And from the first day that I worked at DCA, what they kind of pounded into us was the fact that they look at a contractor mix when they first start, especially in incur cost audit, and looking at you, and they want to know what percent is cost reimbursable to your fixed price, T&M, or commercial. What percentages is that? And there really is no real percentage. If it's 50-50, you can be sure that DCA is going to want to pay attention and may consider doing an actual incurred cost audit rather than just looking at settling your rates. And so, but you got to look at the dollar volume too. And DCA has a fancy acronym, ADV, auditable dollar volume, and how they come up with it, which is basically your cost reimbursable ODCs and any handling rate on T&Ms and so forth. And I think they even back out the sub contracts that you may have that cost reimbursable because in their mind someone else is going to audit it, but they're going to look at the dollar volume with the mix. And because they have this concern, this fear that because you have a cost reimbursable contract and you're losing money on any fixed type award, whether it be commercial, whether it be fixed, they think you're then going to take it and mischarge on a cost reimbursable contract. And that kind of concern and fear is where a lot of their analysis can go. So you should be aware of that. Again, having cost reimbursable contracts with commercial contracts doesn't mean you can't have them, doesn't mean anything is negative. It just means there is a lot more involved in that process. So you can see again, we go down this list. Many of you know all of the requirements. This list really, in many ways, is like what we call that SF 1408 checklist, basically. These are the items that the government wants you to follow, whether it be tracking each item by contract, by delivery order, sometimes even by CLIN or SLIN. Sometimes on research projects, we don't even realize that there are, of course, almost all defense contract, there are contract line items, and we just say, we just see it as a whole. But sometimes on research projects, each CLIN is so unique and so varied, they really want the client to track it by CLIN. But sometimes you don't know until you start invoicing and CLIN 1's done and you start to CLIN 2 and you find out, they reject it because they want to see separate tracking. And that becomes a little bit of a nightmare when you go down to a CLIN contract line item level. And you see the structures, a typical structure that many service firms have is fringe, overhead, and G&A. And do you have the capability of the labor distribution of tracking, direct, indirect, general administrative, bid and proposal, R&D, and so forth, PTO. So these are the things that this cost reimbursable driver brings in our friends DCAA, and some people will run for the hills because it's so much that needs to be done. And here you can see the types of audits. Because you have a cost reimbursable contract, you have to settle your indirect rates. Therefore, you have to do an indirect rate submission that has to go through an adequacy process, and then they determine whether or not it goes into the random sampling and whether they'll sample you or not if you don't have many question costs. So, and if you go down to accounting system reviews, again, you could be under the SBIR program, Small Business Innovative Research, or STTRs. And I think phases 1 and 2 are fixed price. When you get to phase 3, it's cost reimbursable. And guess what happens? Then they want to do an accounting system review of your system. So again, cost reimbursable, the major driver for a lot of this administrative effort. And people, like I say, they have various opinions upon their interest in getting into this work. So again, to reinforce, if you just got time and material and fixed price, they're very compatible with commercial. And you start getting cost reimbursable, you can see all the different things here that are required. Periodic reviews, you got to do this public voucher, which shows a lot more detail than you have obviously on a fixed price invoice. You may just have one line item. And the closeout of cost reimbursable contracts can get quite involved. So,
and Paul, real quick, just a clarification
okay.
on the fixed price side. So I think you're absolutely very clearly drove the point home that I think the biggest level of scrutiny is obviously going to be on the cost reimbursable side. But on the fixed price side, it seems like out of the three kind of most common contract types, T&M, fixed price, and cost reimbursable, fixed price would have the least level of scrutiny just because you agree to a price. If the government agrees to that price, presumably, I mean, do they really care how it's performed after that? Like, what if there is any level of scrutiny, what does it really usually entail?
Well, at least from the pricing side, you're right. I've seen many fixed price contracts for proposals where there's very little scrutiny of the pricing, except if it's subject to something called the truth in negotiations, where you have to provide certified cost of pricing data, and then they want to see all the detail. And then this weird statement, as of the date of the agreement on price, they want to make sure you've given them all the information they have, or it could result in a defective pricing review where the government thinks you're overpricing things in a fixed way, right? Once it's fixed and it's approved. But if there really was no basis for it, or you're playing around with the numbers, they can come back and challenge it. So it is true on a lot of the more simplified fixed price and time and material. It's amazing. I talk with clients. The government doesn't really even require a lot of that cost of pricing detail. It's also an interesting thing that in the FAR 15.4, it says that cost and pricing data and requesting it is the last method. They want you to use price reasonableness and other methods to determine the reasonableness of price without going into it. So there's all this analysis and so forth, but I would agree with you in general. Obviously, there are less things you need to do, but I'd still keep a timekeeping system. I would still once a year do a historical of your indirect rates, and I would use the ICE submission because it will guide you along and help you from making mistakes on what your true rates are. How can you propose if you don't even know what your indirect rates are? So sometimes having a little bit of the cost reimbursable work is actually a benefit for you because it forces more discipline.
Mhm.
Thank you. This is just a little chart, and because a lot of people ask the question, why is it that I have a contract and it's defense and I never hear from DCAA? And yet you're saying, kind of glad they don't show up, but why don't they show up? And very quickly, let's assume you have a defense contract, it gets down to those last two. Is it cost reimbursable? If it's not cost reimbursable, even if you're a prime contractor, um, if it's not cost reimbursable, then DCA will not be as interested. Obviously, if you're not a prime contractor. So DCA or most audit agencies, they will come by and audit your incurred costs if it's cost reimbursable. If you don't have it, you're not going to see them in that way for an incurred cost review and or to settle indirect rates. And the second is, are you a prime or sub? If you note when you submit your ICE submission to the um, portal that DCA has now, which is nice, it's kind of automated and everything, you will notice that when it goes in there, it will ask this question. Is this do you have at least one DoD contract? Is it a prime contract? And is it cost reimbursable? So if you've got fixed price, you can be a prime and be DoD and not hear much from DCA unless it's a specialized review for some purpose. And the same thing you can, if you don't have a cost besides cost reimbursable, if you're not a prime. So it's just a simple little matrix that may help you explain why you're not seeing or hearing from DCA. Now I'm going to turn this over to Yev.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Okay. Let's see what we have next. I think it may be, here we go. Okay, so a lot of what I'm going to cover, in all honesty, I think has been covered very well by both John and Paul. So I will add maybe perhaps a little bit more flavor, if you want to call it, to a lot of what's already been discussed. And what I'm going to primarily focus on is just if you're already a government contractor and you're looking to add that commercial division, if you want to call it, or commercial sphere of your work, what are some of the things to keep in mind about? And we've kind of broken it down into four key categories as you see them listed here. I won't read them off. But if we start with the first one, and the first two, I would say are very closely related. And before I just jump into that, let's get into our second polling question. We promised they wouldn't be too difficult, and hopefully we're staying true to our promise. So, are you excited for fall?
The hard-hitting questions we have for you all today.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
I know. I certainly am. The summer is here where we are. they can get quite difficult with the humidity. So I'm looking forward. Although to your point earlier, John, I didn't realize what fall entails with all the cloudiness and the rain. So kind of forgot that little minor detail, but important. Okay, well, it looks like most of you are excited for fall, just as I am. Hopefully, you're just as excited for the next content to follow. Okay, so what I mentioned earlier is the first 2 points that I had on my earlier slide as far as regulatory compliance and cost segregation are very closely related. I think John and Paul again spoke to this very well and in a very detailed manner. The one thing I think I'll point out, the big takeaway here for me is that in introducing commercial work into your portfolio of contracts, if you will, I think you're opening yourself up more for potential scrutiny with the commercial work. And the reason is because John mentioned the concept of cross-pollination earlier. That's one of the benefits. But I think on the flip side, what you could also be opening yourself up for is the potential for cross-subsidization, meaning that some of your commercial work, or rather, your government contracting work could be subsidizing some of your commercial work. And the government will be very keenly watching out for that to ensure that you're not accidentally or intentionally charging some of the commercial costs to your government contracting work. That's probably the easiest way that I can summarize the risk. And so what that means, and Paul had alluded to it earlier, and he'll speak more to it in more detail, but oftentimes what that will mean is you will want on your indirect cost side separate overhead pools, right? So you don't want one overhead rate for both your government contracting and your commercial work, because that is a very clear example where inadvertently you will almost for sure have commercial costs in that pool. And now how do you break out that you're and confirm that you're not charging those commercial costs to the government? And one other just quick point as it relates to regulation is you don't often think about it, but what you could also be opening yourself up for is the potential for using some of the information you've gained through your government contracting work about what is the government planning, about what are its intentions through the work that you're doing. Even if it's, let's say, not classified work, but even more so if it is classified work, and using that information, even if it's inadvertent or accidentally, in what you're doing on the commercial side. And that's a huge risk. So you want to be very careful with that. And I mentioned that the first slide, the regulatory compliance, and this cost segregation slide, they're very closely related because, again, a lot of it just comes down to making sure you're not charging commercial costs to the government. And the one thing maybe we didn't mention it earlier, but I thought to highlight a big difference that we see in our sphere in outsourced accounting is oftentimes that will start with the chart of accounts. So in most cases, a client with just commercial work usually not be breaking out their composition of an indirect costs into, the typical categories that you see of like fringe, overhead, G&A. If we're talking about the most common kind of 3-tier rate structure on the GovCon side. In commercial, it's usually just an indirect cost, and they may track it in certain ways by department, whatever you want to call it, but they won't necessarily have that natural breakdown in the chart of accounts. Whereas on the GovCon side, we will almost always, at least in most of the work that we do at GRF, we will start out with the chart of accounts and make sure that we're breaking it down into those three, again, depending on your rate structure, let's say a 3-rate structure, and we'll have different pools for the fringe, the overhead, G&A costs.
Hey, yeah.
Okay.
Can I say interject one point?
Absolutely.
Okay, just going back to overheads in general, because overheads and G&A confuse a lot of people. And what is the difference between an overhead and a G&A? And it causes confusion. We all know that G&A is where costs benefit the organization as a whole. Overheads are required because they manage certain aspects. You used one example where an overhead is like commercial, and then there's another for a commercial business, and then another overhead for government. They can also be combined. So it is possible to have both simply because an organization is smaller and it goes through an evolutionary process. So an organization that, let's say, started and chooses to have a fringe over in G&A with both commercial and government may have an overhead that serves both of it simply because it's compatible. On other cases, though, there can be an off-site overhead rate on-site at government site versus off-site at your facility. There can be overheads that are dedicated for fabrication, engineering, manufacturing. It could be two different business lines like logistics, or it could and something else, or it could even be geographic locations. We have an overhead here in the DC area, and we have an overhead in the Norfolk area. But basically, what an overhead is doing is it's, for lack of a better term, it's managing the administrative cost of a group of contracts that are doing a particular purpose. And so, and you might have a VP there, a department head, and their staff, and doing bid and proposal work that's related to that area. So I just wanted to share with you there are a variety of overhead functions. I'll let you get back to it.
No, that's great, Paul. And just to piggyback off of that, I think one of the easiest ways that I found to kind of always remind myself of that key difference between an overhead rate and a G&A rate is basically you can have G&A costs even if you don't have any contracts, right? But it's unlikely that you're going to have overhead costs if you don't have any contracts, because the overhead cost is in some ways the admin costs, like you just said, because you have the contracts.
Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, and so just the last couple of slides from my end on the topic of resource allocation. I won't spend too much time here, but I think again the risk here is that with typically the government contracting work having more strict deadlines and more perhaps scrutiny placed around the deliverables, the just making sure that you're not using during perhaps the slower periods, using some of your government contracting resources on the commercial side that are strictly paid for by a contract with the government. So again, just being very careful with how you're tracking the cost, how you're using your resources to perform the work on both sides. And that again comes to specialized labor. Oftentimes in the government contracting sphere, you're going to have maybe a bit more specialized labor. And just again, just as far as timekeeping policies, having a clear separation there. And then finally, just one thing to note too, I know we mentioned generally speaking, the government contract sphere can provide more stability, but the one thing that you also have to be on the flip side, maybe, as we've often seen over the last few years, the risk of government shutdowns and what that can mean for your funding. So perhaps having having those two pools can help support you during those times if you have a pretty significant or substantial composition of commercial work. So I won't spend much time on this last slide, the cultural and operational differences. I think it's pretty much encapsulated into everything that we've discussed so far up to this point. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Paul.
Thank you, Yev. And an interesting thing is you're right. During a weird time, if there is a government shutdown, certainly having commercial work is a benefit. And what was odd was during COVID time, there was a tremendous concern that a lot of government things would close down, but actually the government work continued on. And, that's why they came up with the PPP loans for small business because they were suffering. So it is interesting as you have this back and forth kind of situation. It all depends. But having diversification, having commercial work is, to me, is a benefit. DCA doesn't look at it negatively. They look at it as something that is a part of the process. They usually see entities that have evolved over time that have both. It's okay if you only have the government side, and that's not a problem, but they're quite adept to it. And the reason is because, as you can see on this, there's efficiencies. And DCA loves those efficiencies. Let's just go into that a little bit on the next slide. Oh, I went too far. Sorry, apologies. Okay, so they love it. They know that because they and the drivers the cost reimbursable, and they know there's all kinds of stuff you've got to do. Even think of the world. Some of you have security clearances, right? And years ago, they used to call it a group called DISCO. I don't know what they call it today, but there's a group within the DoD that manages all those security clearances and so forth. And whether you have something called a SCIF, a special room that you can open up these things and secure, all of this goes into your administrative costs. And DCA knows that without commercial, your G&A, as an example, might be very high, but it goes down. It's offset by all that commercial. They love it. They're all about, I believe, lower rates, although sometimes if the rates are too low, they start to think you're buying in or something like that. So they're always a little bit suspicious about everything, but they generally like it. So you must walk away today not thinking that somehow DCA has a problem with commercial. They don't. They see it as a part of it. They are concerned, like with fixed price and time and material and having cost reimbursable, will you mischarge to cost reimbursable? I just don't see people doing that, but that certainly is a possibility in it. Obviously, with this consolidated G&A, most of the compliance will go into G&A for a variety of responsibility. And the reason why there's improved decision making is if you have it, all of this thinking, all of everything within a consolidated G&A, all that information is in front of you so that you can make these decisions as a whole. If you could have two separate G&As, it'd be very odd. But a combined consolidated G&A makes sense. So that is where we'll leave that, because a lot of these, like Yev has said, has been discussed before, and we just don't want to go over and over and over the same point. So now we move on to something that you should consider, and that is dealing with a more complex business structure. So what happens if you grow? In most cases, they too could segregate. They could be two separate divisions. They could be business units, which becomes like a cost accounting standard discussion. But basically, you could have one that becomes a subsidiary to the other, depending upon the size, or but the most common thing we see is where a large business, multi-billion, they want to get into the working for the government. So they buy this small, like I know one client, a defense firm, and they have no idea just all the complexity, all of the stuff that they're getting themselves into, which we'll talk. But we got to be careful, and they are careful too, to not let the tail wag the dog, so to speak, where the smaller entity is, kind of telling the rest of the organization what to do. And of course, that will never work, because I've seen it and I've seen the cultures and I've seen the pushback. So obviously what they do is, as you will see in the next slide, is they'll take the subsidiary that has the GovCon and they'll basically put it and fence it and box it in. And that's the way that basically they protect the compliance, is by putting it into a subsidiary. And yes, that subsidiary, assuming they have cost reimbursable, whether or not, that's the area that's subject to audit, regulation, review, enforcement from the government and oversight. However, there are issues of the home office. Does the home office allocate costs to the subsidiary that's the defense? And I believe every home office allocation will also be subject to review, like accounting, like IT, like purchasing or HR. So as they allocate stuff down to the subsidiary, those areas would be subject to audit. And so they're very careful which ones they would do, right? And so that's something that they discuss. If it's an executive management group, probably wouldn't want to do it. They probably wouldn't get much more benefit in their G&A rate, because the executive management group is going to do things. They got perks. They may have planes. There's a whole thing in the FAR about planes, and you just don't want to get into that misery. And so for a variety of reasons, if they're smart, the little it might add in recovery of home office allocation isn't really worth it. And we're just going to stay out of that whole area. And just stay with the main core functions if they are allocated down. In some cases, all the accounting or some accounting is done at the subsidiary. For example, let's just use the example of, like, they have Deltec. Deltec would only run the stuff in the subsidiary. It's got a lot of details. Everybody knows Deltec has all that good stuff for tracking. So Deltec is at one level, detail level. When they go to a higher level, and they have maybe SAP or something like that, Deltec will supply to them and will interface with SAP or something like that through a transition where all they'll show is like revenue, cost of goods sold, gross margin, and so forth. And they'll take the GovCon's detailed stuff that came from Deltek and they'll summarize it in a very high level, similar format of reporting for that subsidiary to other compatible with other subsidiaries or other segments of this gigantic organization so management can see it as a whole. And ideally, they'll let the Deltek do its thing, its detail in the subsidiary, but then they report on it at a higher level that's compatible with all the other segments. And that's what we see happening. And so we go to polling question 3 because we are getting close on time here. If I can move it. And it doesn't want to move because of this. Okay. So do you have commercial contracts? Yes, no, and sure. Let's go through that because that's part of the CPE process. And the answer is, do we have that, Nathan? No. Okay, but people are thinking about it, 17%. All right, Yev, let's move it along as we're starting to wrap up our process.
That's right, Paul. Yeah, so we'll probably move a little bit faster through this last section. Just some considerations if you are looking to sell your business, just things to keep in mind if you do have that dual, I should say, work composition, the commercial and the GovCon. So some of the things we're going to talk about, let's just get right into it with the slides. So as far as the separate business units, I think, Paul, you basically spoke to this already. I mean, it helps to highlight the profitability, both of the commercial and the GovCon commercial usually being higher. So there will be interest in the buyers in seeing that. And then also, again, to the extent possible, if you can have the separate overheads for each business line and still have the one single G&A that will likely be lower than if it was broken out, at least separately for the GovCon side. There is strategic interest to do that as buyers are looking at your business. So any thoughts on streamlining operations, John?
Yeah, I'll be quick. We wouldn't be accountants if we didn't bring up accounting systems and policies and procedures here. So just a high level point here is with the advent of all this great technology, most of the accounting systems today are cloud-based or should be cloud-based. Lots of great applications out there to streamline things like your payments, your timesheets, and all that stuff. So definitely keeping your finger on the pulse there. Happy to talk to you about that as well. But the more streamlined your operations, the better you're going to be. And that also applies to policies and procedures and making sure you're following things and having a good organized close process. All those things are really beneficial when you're for sale and, just general good financial hygiene. So lots of great technology out there for you to take advantage of. So just keep that in mind and, feel free to reach out with questions, but pass it right back over to you, Evgeny, to help take us home for the final stretch.
All right.
Yep. And I'm going to pass it right over to Paul. So please,
sorry,
Paul, all of you.
All right. So definitely the importance of if you're structuring for sale, having the appropriate financial records, and that is extremely important. If you've had incurred cost submissions, you have something called a contract brief. That is extremely important. I'm amazed how many organizations don't do that as a discipline, just to even know as you start to get close to CAS coverage and not even knowing where you stand on some of those things. And I don't have time to do it. Well, I think you need to do it at some point. Profit loss analysis, estimate to complete or estimates at completion, those cumulative allowable cost worksheets. There's a lot of things, final invoicing that's associated with cost type contracts. I'm going to turn it right back to John to talk about the very importance of annual audits.
Yeah, I won't spend too much time on this since I know we're running out. So with that, many government contractors are not subject to the same rules and regulations, with respect to nonprofits. Work with a lot of nonprofit clients. But a yearly financial statement audit performed by a firm like GRF can be a really good thing for your organization. The nice thing about being a for-profit business, a commercial business, and a government contractor is that there's just fewer regulations on that, but it can be a good part of that fiscal and financial hygiene that we talked about. So we have some clients that have probably 30, 40, 50, 60 million that are actually just getting a reviewed financial statement. But a yearly audit can help you, especially in the context of structuring for a sale. That highest level of scrutiny on your data is always a good thing. Helps make sure your house is in order. So with that, we can move on to the next section.
Yes, sir. And so our last slide, definitely you're going to have what we call due diligence reviews for the buyer. That's going to be important for them. They have something called letter of intent, and hopefully they get in there. And partly what they're trying to do is mitigate, you know, having legal judgments or liability. They want to totally decrease and have no liability. But we know with DCA and those lovely cost reimbursable contracts, how that issues just don't end in a year. They may settle rates for a year, but the issue just doesn't end. And so they want to know, where are those things at a certain point of time, should they make the purpose. We also end where we talk a little bit about the movement into ESG areas of diversity, equity, inclusion, and environmentalism. If you look now at FAR subpart 23.5, it does talk about greenhouse gas emissions and tracking those, scopes 1 and 2. And then if you do reporting it on your website, especially if you're over 7.5 million, it's a part of your terms and conditions, although I haven't seen much of that. And there's even going to be more changes afoot, depending upon who wins the election. And of course, dealing with cybersecurity is extremely important. I just want to leave with one big key takeaway. If you've got fixed price, time and material, government contracts, it is very compatible, obviously, with commercial. If you add the cost type, you just have to realize, as I went ad nauseum into it, just how much more burden it's going to affect, the administrative burden. I think most people realize that. Hopefully, we've quantified that for you today. So I will turn it back over to Yev and any final questions and statements.
Yeah, no, that's great, Paul. And I think I appreciate you driving that point home. I think that's crucial. So I think looking at the time, we probably have maybe time for one, perhaps maybe two questions and before we wrap up today. The first one being, so how do we segregate costs between our commercial and government work? I think we answered that, but more specifically, with respect to cost policy statements, what is that statement? What should it reflect if you do have commercial and government work? Any thoughts, guys?
Cost policy statement, which probably in FAR jargon is disclosed cost accounting practices. Yes, you should have written policies and procedures that show both, that show, again, the importance of time tracking, a lot of the importance of the things that, if you go back to some of those slides that I talked about, that DCA wants. Actually, if you go back to the presentation and I started to list, whether it be proposals, whether it be cost or pricing data, whether it be preparing certain invoices, your disclosed cost accounting practices as it's required for FAR 15.4, somewhere in that table 15.2. I know it's a lot of detail, but it's what it refers to. That's what you start to write down as your policies and procedures. And it would be heavy on the government side, because no matter what you do, depending upon the size, unless you got two separate entities that's totally commercial or totally GovCon, the GovCon is going to wag the tail of the dog.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then we also got one question about if it's possible for us to assist with developing compliant timekeeping procedures that work for both government and commercial projects. I mean, I can hopefully speak for the three of us and say we're always happy to help. So just reach out. And it's in some ways going to be dependent on your entity and things like that. So there is always a bit of nuance. But yes, we're always happy to help. And to that point too, if during this presentation there were any questions that we accidentally skipped or any questions that came to your mind afterwards, our contact information is here. So please do always feel free to reach out. We're always happy to help talk through these things. So don't ever hesitate. So with that, I think we're right on time. We want to thank everybody for joining. And we appreciated the interaction today and the engagement. We always like that. We enjoy talking about these things. So we encourage you to follow us on social media. We're at GRFCPAs, and also visit our website for all the upcoming events and alerts that we have. Please also do remember to complete that survey if you do want your CPE, and hopefully you were able to participate in our very difficult CPE questions throughout. And as always, thank you for joining. Have a great day, and thanks for your participation.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.